Welcome, fellow Earthlings, to our corner of the universe for this week's episode of Space Times Podcast. I'm Harrison Lambert, here with Paul Mayer, excited to go over all this week's exciting times in space with you. All right, Paul, you want to tell me all about launchers and the advances going on in that field this week?
Yeah, happy to do so, Harrison. A couple of big updates. The first of which we'll talk about is some updates from our good friend Dan Jablonski at Ursa Major. So we go way back with Dan Jablonski, but Ursa Major just announced a $100 million Series E for scaling hypersonics and solid rocket motors. And the reason that we want to hit on this first is that actually this ties in well with what Avio has been working on. We've mentioned Avio a couple of times over the last few weeks here. And Avio is working under a Lockheed Martin contract. They're opening up manufacturing and capability here in the US. And they're taking their solid rocket technology and looking to apply it to some of the Lockheed Martin missile capacity and missile needs that have been expressed. Ursa Major is raising this Series E for hypersonics and solid rocket motors, meaning that the two of them are both going to be solving the same problem. So Lockheed is looking already at this stage to contract out a diverse manufacturer and a diverse supplier base for this need. But just to start off, some old friends in the industry are also playing with some new friends in the industry. And there's a lot of demand and a lot of need that's being met in that capacity.
You know, if anyone could take on the Italians, I would bet on our good friend Dan. It's quite odd to see him go from, Digital Globe, Maxar, whatever you want to call it, over to a rocket company. And I hadn't heard much from them, lately. I think he's been there about a year. But there's a lot of big news coming out of them in the past few weeks. $100 million Series E. That's a pretty late series, but that's a lot of money. And it's for scaling technology that they already have. They have their I think it's a liquid rocket engine that they're kind of scaling for hypersonics. I think it was originally planned to kind of be an engine producer for other companies, kind of how Vulcan was kind of leveraging Blue Origin. I think they had actually looked at Ursa Major at some point. But this raise is really showing a shift over to a couple of markets that we've seen accelerating in recent months. Hypersonics has had a lot of interest. We've talked about things like the rotating detonation rocket engine. There's some tech with other hybrid rockets and some ramjets coming out like GE Aerospace and Raytheon and those kind of companies. And it's no surprise that Lockheed has interest in kind of fostering this capability. The solid rocket motors is another field that's been really exploding recently. In a financial sense, not a technical sense. I hope none of their rockets actually explode.
Figurative sense.
No, we don't like solid rockets exploding. It's a bad history in the space industry of that. But solid rockets. It's surprising to see the tech come back. I think there's a couple of things driving it. One is a lot of wartime production going on. Obviously, we talked about Avio. A lot of the money going to them was for the Ukraine war, but just last week we talked about them expanding to the US, so having a domestic competitor to that will be great. They're on the same contract under Lockheed, so there's some variance in suppliers that Lockheed gets out of that. And I think the other aspect that's also very new is in-orbit interceptors. Having rockets on orbit to shoot down other rockets that are being launched from the ground. All the people that have talked about it so far have kind of proposed solid rockets as the on-orbit option because they store very easily. So those are a couple of factors. Avio obviously has the Vega C and the Ariane 6 driving a lot of their market, but I think they're getting a lot of driving force from this missile industry, because the throughput and the recurring payments are much higher because they blow up every single one they build, whereas Ariane and Vega is not launching all that often, but they are kind of standout. They are kind of standout rockets, launch vehicles, because we don't really use solid motors that much in the US anymore. It's on the SLS, but that thing doesn't really launch. It just gets built. And China still uses them. They had a huge solid rocket launch a few weeks ago, so there's obviously still some use for it, but we're seeing the use for it spread across multiple industries, which I think is a great sign for that technology and those kind of businesses to grow. So hopefully the 100 million for Ursa Major goes a long way and towards scaling out their business to something that's really recurring and big.
Yeah, I think the we'll say sort of proliferation of solid rocket tech throughout or solid motor tech throughout the industry in more discrete use cases is something to be expected, as the industry itself sort of matures and you start to see specializations of technology for each different use case. But given the technical challenge and the demands of the industry, nobody wants to go all in on one particular solution. So we're going to see the more well-defined, we're going to see the more well-understood technologies wind up having use cases, even if they are sort of as redundancy or secondary purpose. So just, because solid rocket motors are better understood than cryogenic rocket motors at this point, because that technology is more matured and more well developed, we will likely see the first space-based interceptors have a solid rocket architecture rather than a liquid rocket architecture, like some of the new startups in the space that we've been talking about. But interesting stuff. Also interesting to me was, without getting too personal here, but so our experience with Dan was one in which Dan stepped into a company that was experiencing some difficulties and experiencing some challenges and was effectively in duress. And Dan Jablonski did a great job of effectively righting that ship and getting the company that he joined on to well positioned. Under his leadership, we made, I'll say, one major sort of pivot, refocused on a different market space. And so, Ursa Major is a company that I haven't heard from in a little while. And sort of to your point, it's interesting to see that Dan Jablonski has been there for going on a year. He's been there for almost a year, and Ursa Major has similarly, seemingly, rehoned its focus in that time to another growing market, to another growing industry. So all of this to say that it looks like Ursa Major is in some good hands here, because Dan has executed a similar playbook before, us being sort of primary beneficiaries of that in our time. But great to see the success that Ursa Major has achieved, and we're definitely excited to keep following along with them.
Yeah, and I think that the Hadley 1, I believe, is the name of their main liquid engine, and they've had, I think it was like 30 or 60 test fires of that engine, so it's running smoothly. A lot of this movement, I think, is in the solid rocket kind of industry, but I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens in the hypersonic industry. I mean, he had an earnings conversation where he was emphasizing the use for hypersonics. I think there's still kind of a missile application for that motor, and less so for launch vehicles. But as we've seen with other companies like Avio, there's a real dual purpose to this tech. And I think the market for hypersonics is going to be, I don't know, a bit bigger. I think the solid rockets have a higher cash flow to them, but hypersonics has more growth potential. I mean, just given the fact that like solid rockets, there weren't that many manufacturers up till recently. Like Morton Thiokol was the big one because they did the space shuttles. And the only other one I could think of was like Estes, which honestly, I didn't even know they built like production scale solid motors. I thought they just built like the little model rocket motors that we used in college to practice with, but apparently like they're really good at building solid motors and actually like at a production scale, which it's not necessarily one-to-one. Like producing solid motors is just as much an art as a science. And the companies that have done it, went through their paces to figure it out, and they had their issues, and they've blown up facilities and all that sort of stuff getting there. So the few incumbents that there are very experienced and have that skill set behind them, which is why I find it very interesting that Voyager was able to acquire Estes as a company, taking one of the old school players out of that field and kind of entering Voyager into this kind of growing industry, which puts them across a lot of different industries, given how many acquisitions they've made this year. We mentioned Bridgecom for optical terminals. We mentioned Exoterra for electric propulsion. Now they've got Estes for solid propulsion. And I think they're really just positioning themselves to be this on-orbit defense infrastructure company, like being able to plug into, proliferated warfighter networks with their optical terminals, being able to maneuver around with their electric propulsion, their Starlab collaboration for on-orbit habitats. And, as we've seen a lot of habitat companies positioning themselves for on-orbit manufacturing. And with the Estes Energetics, I can only imagine this is a play to put them in that on-orbit interceptor market that we're seeing emerge from a few players, such as the Orbital Magazine from Apex Space and Lockheed Martin's on-orbit interceptor program. So, they could be trying to get in on those Lockheed contracts that were given to like Ursa Major and Avio. I could see that happening. They could be just going for their own entirely separate play in this field.
Yeah, I mean, Voyager Space is currently going through a pretty standard post-IPO growth strategy. So they IPO'd in, I believe it was June. So you can look at the calendar and it's like clockwork. IPO in June, almost exactly 1 quarter later, they start making acquisitions, and they've been acquiring a company a month since that starting pistol fired. So September, October, November, Estes being the most recent. So I'd be very interested in seeing what Dylan Taylor's track record was at, I believe his previous role was CEO of Colliers International. But I'd be interested in seeing what his track record of leadership was in previous companies to see whether this is a unique play on his part of trying to vertically integrate and buy up all of this capacity via acquisition, or whether this is something that he did in his previous role. And this is sort of a tried and true strategy on his part. But Voyager very much is very much following that sort of tried and true strategy of acquiring a bunch of EBITDA, acquiring a bunch of capacity and capability shortly after IPO, largely off of the funds raised from the IPO. And we're gonna have to follow them over the coming years with great interest to see how they're able to execute on all of that. Additionally, there's been a couple of big milestones to hit. Rocket Lab hit their 18th launch this year, and their most recent quote unquote follow my speed launch, I believe that was a 5-hour gap that they were able to close.
Yeah, it was a cross-country launch. They launched in Vandenberg, and then within 5 hours launched out of Wallops in Virginia. So that's some crazy coordination. They didn't say who the follow my speed launch was for. Apparently it's a commercial customer, which is kind of interesting. I don't know what commercial customer is trying to do rapid deployment. The only times I've seen that be a mission is for companies like Astra or the Victus missions out of Firefly. So I hope at some point they announce who that commercial customer is. But I mean, beyond that, like the 18 launches alone is an impressive feat. That's for one company, that's quite a bit. SpaceX is obviously the leader. I think over 100. China's got like 70, and then I think Rocket Lab comes in third, which is great. I mean, it's Electron, so it's a little bit of a smaller rocket, but it does show that there's a demand for it, a not insignificant demand for it. and they're able to consistently hit their targets and deploy. I also find that interesting that about 15 of those 18 launches were standard orbital launches at a small lift capability. But also interesting is that three of them were suborbital, and those were for suborbitals, typically for like tech testing, usually like sounding rockets for microwave detection, or just like space environment low gravity testing for new tech. But the other thing it's sometimes useful for is hypersonics testing, which I think is an interesting indicator, especially off the back of Ursa Major indicating that a lot of their money is going to be spent on the hypersonics industry. And the amount of funding being spent by ESA and China on hypersonics means that there is a growing demand in this field. And it's interesting to see, because I think what's happening is kind of the tech is starting to catch up with the applications. And we're probably at the pivoting point where we can start applying that tech to real use cases. I think a lot of the cases would be like, a lot of the cases I'd be interested in are like single stage to orbit planes, supersonic jets. I know probably what most people are interested in, i.e. the government, is for hypersonic missiles. But there's definitely a growing demand here. I mean, Hyperspace raised like 21 million euro this past week for their orbital Baguette 1 suborbital rocket. So there's some development being done by Europe to create a hypersonic test platform. I would definitely expect to see some more growth in this over the coming year.
In addition to some of these launches that we've been talking about in launch news, there's also been some big momentum in another space that we're really excited about here on the show, which is the VLEO sector. So Redwire just announced a $44 million DARPA contract to build out their Otter VLEO air-breathing satellite. Now, VLEO and air-breathing satellites are largely unproven technology at this point. However, it represents a pretty meaningful step change in the capabilities and the potential products derived therefrom. So this is something that we've been both independently and professionally excited about for a good couple of years. There have been multiple companies that I've looked at, multiple startups that I've looked at in this space, and it's really exciting and fun to see some top-down government money going to this explicit application. It very much sort of validates the market. It very much proves out, hey, the demand is there, the capabilities, if they aren't currently there, will be there soon. So I think over the next couple of years, we're going to see some real commercial customers follow this sort of signal and follow this lead. And I think we're going to see this market materialize and grow in the next 18 to 24 months to a point where it's one that isn't speculative anymore. It's one where investment is feasible, and it's not too quote unquote science fiction-y yet.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see what sort of applications they use this technology for. I mean, I'm like you, I'm just really excited about the technology. Air breathing thrusters haven't been around for too long, and so they haven't really been flown much. I think the only one I know about is the GOES satellite from Italy. It was a gravitational wave monitoring satellite. I think it was launched like 8 years ago, nearly a decade ago. So it's not unused technology, but it's a pretty unused domain. And we've mentioned recently, like high altitude platforms that are having a comeback, and this whole like distributed proliferated network technology that's growing, these mega constellations, having the need for a hybrid system that uses lower altitudes to expand coverage and revisit rate and all these sort of things is great, and it's growing. And VLEO is a pretty open domain, and if they can get the air breathing technology right, those satellites can stay up there for a long time, so the cost to replenish them is a lot lower. Obviously there's a lot of challenges with VLEO. The tech's pretty new, there's not a lot of demand for it yet. The other VLEO tech companies I've heard of recently, like Albedo, didn't have a lot of success. I hadn't heard anything about their mission going well, and I know they're pivoting away from their initial product offering. So I think this is a challenging space. I think the fact that it's DARPA giving them money further emphasizes the fact that this is a very advanced technology. The industry is not quite there. And I hope that, they've already figured out the air breathing buster technology, and this money can be spent towards solving some of the more application focused problems. Because, when it comes to comms, when it comes to imaging, having a lower orbit, the speed at which you're traveling is going to cause issues. Integration time on imagers becomes a problem. Powering the comms radios and all of that, and having ground stations be able to track it, unless you use phased arrays, you're going to have issues. So lots of problems in this space, lots of stuff to figure out. 44 million is not a huge sum of money, but hopefully it's enough to do whatever this mission that DARPA wants to do is. It's called Otter.
Yeah, I'm optimistic that the 44 million here is going to be used more to solve some of the second order technical challenges that you identified, rather than the fundamental F equals MA VLEO air breathing, the primary challenge here. But either way, it's one of the first examples of explicit government money going to solving the technical problems necessary for VLEO to materialize, which is great to see. With most of these technologies, typically what you see is government money go in first, and then commercial money follow after it's been initially sort of de-risked there. Then you'll start to see some of the more ambitious and risk tolerant investors willing to invest after there's been sort of that primary technology proven out. So once we're no longer needing to prove that the air breathing thruster actually works, and then we're proving out that, hey, all of these second order problems, the fact that we're moving at such a higher velocity, at so much closer, that we need to now redesign the camera for Earth observation to be able to properly interpolate the image and to properly transfer the data. Like, that level of technological challenge is one where typically more ambitious commercial investors feel more comfortable getting involved. And so regardless, this is all positive for the industry. This is all moving the ball in the right direction. So we're definitely excited to see it. Another fun project that's out there that we wanted to briefly touch on was the Swift satellite mission extension. So Catalyst has selected the Northrop Grumman Pegasus rocket for the Swift satellite's extension mission. They've got roughly 8 months before Swift's orbital decay becomes irreparable. And one of the key reasons why they've selected the Pegasus is because of that quick timeline, but also because the Swift satellite's current inclination is 20.5 degrees roughly, which is pretty hard to reach from any domestic launch site. So because Pegasus is launched from 39,000 feet, because it's plane mounted and ignites at altitude, you can effectively deploy it from anywhere in the Earth, rather than just from the limited launch sites that we have access to here stateside. So they're able to solve some neat problems here, and hopefully they'll be able to properly extend Swift's lifespan and help keep the mission alive. But it's another fun one to not quite Apollo 13, but it's another fun mission to keep track of.
I think it has interesting implications. I think Catalyst has been very clear that this mission is more of a demo to the defense industry, that they're able to have this reactive capability to boost satellites, particularly going out to satellites that might be getting intercepted by foreign adversaries, and being able to either repair or fuel supply to them. And I just find this whole confluence of activities very interesting. I mean, we talked about Rocket Lab with the rapid turnaround. If they can launch on a Pegasus, I don't see why they couldn't launch on a Rocket Lab Electron. Obviously, the launch site is kind of the issue, the low inclination of Swift causes issues, and Pegasus kind of overcomes that. But if we start solving these launch-based issues, or Rocket Lab finds a way to launch Electron from wherever, that could provide a really interesting interplay there. I do find it that might be like it might not help Catalyst a bunch that they chose Pegasus, given that it's a Northrop Grumman launch vehicle, and Northrop Grumman has the MEV. So there's no reason Northrop Grumman can just say we can do this on our own. They have their own launch vehicle, they have their own mission extension vehicle. Like, why do we need Catalyst? Just a very young company. They haven't demonstrated any capability before. Maybe things all work out and we have multiple suppliers, which the defense industry loves to have. And honestly, I hope that's what happens. But it's an interesting mission with a lot of implications beyond just extending the lifetime of a space observatory.
So finally, for launch, SpaceX and Blue Origin both have a couple of updates here, but SpaceX was able to effectively land their Starship.
No, launch is the right word. Launch, then land. I think that's what everybody calls it.
Launched their Starship. I believe it was one day before the.
Was it really? It was very close. Yeah.
Yeah. So they've managed to close the lap, and they are officially one generation ahead of Blue Origin's New Glenn. So the petty race continues.
On the back of that launch of the Kuiper satellites, where they launched one additional satellite, gosh, unreal. These past few months, they've just been it's just been SpaceX trying to one up Blue Origin.
Oh, it's been fun to watch. I hope you have your popcorn.
Yeah.
But the Starship popped on the test stand. Not a euphemism. They're buckled in a couple of spots. So SpaceX needs to go back to the gym a little bit, get Starship back into shape here. But that's good as we head into the winter. It's prime bulking season, I guess.
Yeah, at least lay off the voids.
Yeah, so everybody's working. Blue Origin is similarly sort of planning some upgrades for New Glenn after their successful launch last week, or was it 2 weeks ago?
That was last week.
So everybody's improving and back at the gym here, but
hopefully New Glenn doesn't pop anything, because they're just now arriving at operationalization. To have a failure at this stage would suck. But Starship blowing up a tank, what's new? I mean, it's not on purpose, but they're in testing. They're implementing a new generation of Starship. It's to be expected. They have some failures, and this wasn't a huge explosion. This was they were intentionally testing their tanks with gas, following some welding and assembly procedures. So failed at a weld, learned their lesson. Hopefully they can rebuild quickly and get on to their next launch.
Not a big setback for SpaceX by any means, and no setbacks for Blue Origins. But moving on, there's a couple of big updates that we wanted to talk about and hit on the global or national level here. So we've spoken a couple of times about Germany's massive investment into the space sector. It's been ballpark of about 50 billion. So France recently announced not quite as much, but a similarly large $5 billion investment in new funding for military space as part of a refreshed national space strategy. And simultaneously, Canada, everybody's favorite European nation, committed $500 million to the European Space Agency themselves.
They speak French too. It's probably in solidarity.
It might very well be, but this hits on a couple of big patterns and a couple of big themes that we've noticed throughout. One of which is a pattern of European and allied nations looking to provide space sovereignty and effectively reducing dependence on both American and Chinese components, launch providers, partners. So we're seeing that happen across the spectrum, not just in Europe. And additionally, we're seeing some extensive militarization in space. Despite everybody's stated desire to keep space a non-militarized domain, we're seeing some pretty extensive investment and government spending, just sort of, I'll say, reckoning with the reality of the situation that there is going to be some extensive defense needs in the sector, and those are two of the big patterns and strategies that we're seeing. But I know you were excited to talk through sort of how the European collaboration might wind up comparing to the U.S. effort and the Chinese space programs overall. So, what have you got for us, Jim?
I mean, I don't have 50 billion, but I've got some opinions. I think it's funny that like Germany, like it's like scaling down by an order of magnitude for every country that chips in. I think it was like 50 billion from Germany, and then France like, fine, we'll do 5 billion, and then Canada's like, hold up, we got 500 million to throw in there. So expect to start hearing $5,000 raises soon. Maybe like Luxembourg will chip in. They got some space money. But I just find this whole like ESA, the whole ESA news is just, it feels very frenetic. Like it's more and more feeling like they're playing catch up, and they're realizing, how much they have to get like stuff figured out quickly. It's not totally unreasonable. Like, we only recently have started severing ties between the US and the EU, and it's unfortunate. I think we are better together, but I think there could be some benefit out of this. Like, even within the US, we're trying to diversify our supply chain, having there still be allied ties between the EU and the US, but having separate sort of industries that work together to some extent, maybe not as much as they have, I think is still great. And I think what we're going to see is more of a fracture, like an antitrust kind of fracture, where all the pieces are able to then compete within the market and grow to be a combined size larger than they were when they're together. I think there's some benefit to being allied. I think there's some resilience there, but I think what we're learning through the space industry and what a lot of the Defense Department is signaling is that we need diversification. We need multiple suppliers. There's some resilience in that capability. And I think it's one that China's mirroring, the fact that they have multiple different companies that they fund to do every aspect. I think the main thing that I would hope ESA figures out is how to better coordinate all these different companies. We talked last week about the merger of Thales and Leonardo and Airbus, and I think it's a decent approach, but I think it's largely the kabuki theater. I feel like those companies are still going to be operating independently. I think it's reflected in some of the comments they've made about the Argonaut lander this past week. That's their lunar lander effort. Originally, it was kind of just Thales led, but they're now expanding it to be a bunch of companies, most of which are just subsidiaries of Thales, which feels very disjointed. It's kind of their way of spreading this funding and construction around UK, Italy, Germany, France, all of those areas. And then they added in OHB, who's been complaining recently about not being considered kind of being left out of these larger companies, which they are a large space company, and they have their own kind of projects going on. But I think we're starting to see a lot of the growing pains of trying to get all these companies to play nicely together. And even like when we mentioned Avio moving their rocket manufacturing for Ariane 6 up to Germany, ESA has indicated that that's going to slip from this next year to being like 2029, which could be an indication that's just not going to happen at all. So it just feels like there's a lot of politics being played in between them. It reminds me a lot of like congressional pork barreling in the US, where they try to send money to certain districts to keep manufacturing, like in Arkansas or in Utah with Orton Thiokol. And it's not beneficial. It leads to things like the SLS, which is like a hugely bloated program, versus something nimble like SpaceX. So I hope they find a less political way to kind of get all their companies to work together. I think they do have a good distribution of technology capability companies. I think they need to kind of keep that instead of just aggregating it all. But in some cases, it makes sense if they really are trying to compete with Starlink or China or something more like centrally controlled. They're going to need some central control, but I think they need to get away from some of the politics that come with that.
Yeah, I think so. The privilege of joining the Space Tech Expo in Bremen last week. Great conference. Glad to have been able to attend for their 10th iteration. One of the major themes of a lot of the different speakers, one of the themes of a lot of the programming was that there's a need and a desire for sovereignty, for independent capability, independent meaning independent of U.S. and Chinese components, providers, partners, etc. So wanting to be sovereign, self-sufficient, etc. And sort of the flip side of that coin was the sort of, to your point, the realization of just how big that gap currently is. So I think the fact that we're seeing what could potentially be some of these growing pains of getting so many different stakeholders aligned on achieving sort of the desired end state, on achieving the actual end goals. I'm optimistic that that our European counterparts will be able to learn from some of the mistakes, to improve upon some of the challenges that American development had when there was so much, I believe the term you used was pork barreling. So I'm optimistic that Ariane 7 isn't going to wind up being an SLS equivalent, but one of the overwhelming themes from Bremen was sort of twofold. That there is a big gap, and we need to collaborate and work together in order to overcome it. So the fact that OHB wants to be involved on this, that, or the other contract, that they feel like they're missing out, the fact that Thales might want Avio to stay in Italy rather than relocating to Germany, or that Italy may want Avio to stay, the Italian government may want them to stay there rather than to see that economic growth relocate to Germany. It's sort of the unfortunate nature of the beast. I'm optimistic that the ESA and our European counterparts will be able to sort of thread that needle and be able to problem solve in a way where they're able to continue to grow and develop and move the ball forward in a productive way. But that sort of centralized control, that centralized decision making and leadership is part of the reason why China's program is developing and maturing so rapidly. And it's one of the key sort of architectural hurdles that any sort of NASA or ESA led effort is going to need to overcome. So I'm optimistic that we'll see some of these political hurdles resolve and minimize, but they can definitely, these molehills can definitely be made into mountains if we allow them to. So hopefully everybody's able to get on the same page and pull in the same direction here, because the amount of investment that we're seeing, I'll go ahead and round up and call it 100 billion combined in European investment in the space. That is a really impressive, meaningful hurdle and meaningful contribution to the entirety of Europe's space sovereignty.
Yeah, it's more than China's spending. I don't think as much as the U.S. is spending, but as is in line with the rest of what they're doing, it seems to be a hybrid approach between China and the U.S., where they have some of that central control like China has, given the EU's structure, but all this money is very quickly flowing into the hands of European companies. We've seen a huge surge in German funding to space companies off the back of their announcement. Similarly in France. So I think they're using that kind of capital capitalism driving force that U.S. uses with their space industry, and merging that with kind of a central control. That being said, they're further behind on their own planning. So I think it's U.S. is still in the lead. China is very quickly catching up, and ESA is finding its footing to enter this race with us. But I know it feels like China's got so much news going on, like they've had so much progress, and they're able to replicate a lot of what the U.S. is able to do. Like they're very close to being able to do everything that we can.
It's very impressive that they're able to strand their astronauts on orbit as well.
Only advanced countries like the U.S. can do that. I didn't know Boeing operated in China.
Joke.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't laugh until they actually get their next vehicle up there. Right now they are stranded. Well, not stranded. They have one vehicle, but it's not a big enough vehicle to get all of them down, because now they have 2 crews up there. They'll need another vehicle up there to have their safety craft. But luckily they've still got the Shenzhou 21 capsule up there. So if the need arises, they are able to bring their astronauts down. But they're in a very similar scenario to where Starliner was with ISS last year. It will be interesting to see how quickly they can alleviate the situation, given that Starliner took almost a year. But not just Starliner, but having a Dragon capsule get up there to get our astronauts down took about a year.
I think it was 9 months.
Yeah, that sounds right. So it'll be really interesting to see how quickly they can get the Shenzhou 22 up there.
We're gonna have to strand some more astronauts at the ISS just so that we can get them down quicker than China got their folks down before too long. But we are equal parts impressed and glad to see that the Chinese space program is on track to get their people back more rapidly than we were able to get our stranded astronauts back earlier this year. So all of that being said, one of the other sort of big developments, one of the other big updates is some messaging out of the U.S. Space Force, and this this future operating environment and objective force represent sort of a 15-year plan that works alongside Vector 2025, but it maps out sort of desired and required capabilities through 2040, and it's a pretty explicit mandate or signal for on-orbit servicing, on-orbit refueling over the next 15 years. And again, sort of similar to the VLEO announcements earlier, and that signal coming out of DARPA, we would expect to see sort of on-orbit servicing, RPO capabilities, refueling on orbit. We would expect to see commercial demand and commercial capability mimic the very explicit government demand that's being announced now. So while 2040 and while 15 years is sort of a long timeline, I think we can expect the commercial sector to mimic and adopt this timeline. And in practice, that 15 years will probably look more like that 15-year end date will probably look more like a 7 to 10-year end date. So I think we can expect to see some rapid growth and some rapid maturation in these spaces as commercial investor and commercial interest follow where the government money is going.
I really hope you're right. Like, I think 15 years is probably a bit optimistic, but I hope it's just setting a lofty target and we actually nail it or come in closer. It's kind of a shift from what the U.S. government has been prioritizing, which is proliferated warfighter networks, these mega constellation communication networks, Golden Dome, so missile defense. Like, these are pretty traditional applications of space, but just at a scale we've never seen before, which is what's driving a lot of these large constellations, large on-space structures. But we're also seeing a lot of knock-on industries and markets coming off of those. Having mega constellations gives the platform for on-orbit data centers, which is a whole other $1 trillion industry that requires in-orbit manufacturing to scale to the size that Earth needs, and in-orbit manufacturing can be used for lunar applications and Mars. So we're seeing this kind of expansion beyond just like normal Earth applications of space, and I like that the U.S. government is reflecting that growth in clear, direct communication, and hopefully the funding to back that up.
I think finally, before we jump into the lightning round here, we wanted to hit on a couple of geo updates. So EchoStar in their 10Q announced that the HughesNet doesn't have enough cash to operate within the next 12 months, and that they'll be referring customers to Starlink. So despite that huge influx of capital from the actual spectrum sale, EchoStar is still not going to be funding operations, and they're going to be pushing people off onto Starlink already. So some of the trends and patterns that we've been highlighting and expressing as likely outcomes are already materializing.
And it's like they get 17 billion, and then it's like their kid comes to them like, "Can I have $1 for some ice cream?" And they turn out their pockets like, "I had nothing for you." And I mean, pointing at the customers towards Starlink like makes sense. Just most of the 17 billion was in SpaceX stock, so if they redirect all their business over to there, like they're still going to make money long term off of that. It just sucks to see. I mean, they're only selling spectrum, so theoretically they could still operate. And that spectrum was really only useful for like direct-to-device communications. But they traditionally been a geocom operator, and they just a year ago launched Jupiter 3, which is like the biggest geocom satellite ever. And it has like a 10-year lifetime. They spent $800 million on it. And you and I, like, we worked on it for years, and I was like so excited to actually see it make it to orbit, because that
we have blood, sweat, and tears in that satellite. Yeah.
Oh my god! Yeah, I thought some of that blood would break it on the manufacturing floor, or like a rocket would fall apart on the launch because this thing's massive, or it just like wouldn't work when it got to orbit. But no, it works fine. But
knock on wood, we got it up there. It's working. It's operating. It's doing everything that it needs to do.
Yeah,
and
then
it's
only
such
for
a
a
success
year
that EchoStar is effectively shuttering operations.
Yeah, $800 million over a year. Like, I guess what do they care? They got $17 billion just for selling some pieces of paper. Like, I guess the real business isn't in the engineering; it's in the horse trading of assets. So I don't know what happens to Jupiter 3. They've got other satellites on orbit. I think they have a few. It's like EchoStar 13. I think Jupiter 3 was like EchoStar 13. I think they still had like 4 active EchoStar satellites. So I don't know. Like, that sucks. I hope Hughes is able to survive operating, but it sounds like they've already given up. So I don't know what they're going to do with those geo birds. It'll be really interesting to see.
I mean, the birds are such capital intensive assets that somebody will continue to make money off of them elsewhere, whether they sell that sort of capability or capacity off to another partner, or whether they sort of sell it or try to operate the satellite like at discount. But there's still money to be made off of it. So, price point is $800 million. Maybe if you're EchoStar, maybe if you're the person who bought it at full price, maybe you have to sell it at a loss. But if the satellite's not able to generate $800 million, price tag worth of revenue, maybe it's able to, maybe that economics loop, maybe that closes at a $500 million price tag or a $400 million price tag or something to that effect. So that satellite will still continue to operate, just sort of to your point, sort of the horse trading of it all. Who winds up holding the reins at the end, that remains to be seen. But
they could sell to another company, like, I don't know, not Globalstar, they're selling out too, but like, I don't know, SES, Eutelsat, like Viasat, Telesat, like they're all still operating geocom satellites. So maybe one of them will take it. It certainly would be an asset to other geocom providers that are already operating there. I could see maybe some shift in its application. There's been some talk recently from smaller like LEO constellation operators about using geocom satellites as sort of a blanket kind of backhaul facet to their space systems. I mean, if you like flip the Starlink upside down and it was beaming to geo rather than to Earth, like you could use its optical terminals, kind of patch it into a geocom network and augment its throughput. But I think it makes more sense when I hear companies like Astranis talk about it, where they're just actively designing new geo satellites that have like software defined radios and the capability to reconfigure their antenna patterns or things like that, where they're able to adapt to new use cases. But I think Jupiter 3 and a lot of the GeoBirds that the EchoStar flies are pretty set in their configuration that they launched with. So
yeah, they're a hard sort of fixed asset for sure. So again, they'll probably somebody will buy it, somebody will operate it, somebody will run that satellite. It's too capable and too valuable to go completely to waste. But I would not at all be surprised if there's if a different operator winds up buying it for much less than the actual sticker price of what that satellite cost. Just because EchoStar appears to be pretty clearly sort of exiting the market. So if they want to get something for it or want to try and close that loop, they're probably not in the best negotiating spot to try and demand full price for anything.
Yeah. No, I think I was just gonna say, like, I think this is a big signal that the geo market is shifting, if not ending. There's been a lot of doomerism about geo markets for 10, 20 years now. It was
literal decades.
Yeah, I guess huge in the 90s, like the dot-com bubble, that kind of era where like internet backhaul was coming up and all the cell towers hadn't proliferated Earth, and like there were applications for it, and there's a lot of money there, and there's not as much now. And we see smaller companies kind of stepping up and mega constellations kind of stepping in to basically update this system. So it's not surprising that EchoStar would exit this. It's kind of been a long time coming. Honestly, not that surprising at all. Honestly, what I find more surprising is companies like SES, another geocom provider, signing some contract to extend the life of their geo satellites. They signed with Infinite Orbits to create a docking vehicle that will launch in 2027. So even in 2 years, and then from there it will extend it who knows how many years. But they're anticipating usefulness for their satellites at least for another probably decade at that point. Which I'm of two minds about. One is like, does the market even exist at that point? But on the other hand, like there is still some need for it. So in this case, maybe resupplying it, extending its life really is more cost effective than launching a new one. In the past that hasn't been true, but we've seen a lot of companies try to develop new technology for this. We've seen recently China and America doing RPO on geo satellites for refilling for mission extension. So this could just be, SES trying to use their assets to kind of pivot into a new arena that's growing in space, and taking Infinite Orbits with it, which is a French company. So like we've said, there's some money there to grow that capability, and that's a technology that every country wants. So they raised 40 million euro for in-orbit servicing. It's a market that's been around for quite a few years, but most of the players in there are kind of early. But I would anticipate that they're coming in at just the right time, and there's some demand for it, if not from SES, from other government entities. So we're watching that closely. But where I see like most of the potential for active geo activities is in the smaller satellite segment. So Astranis is kind of the big player. There's other players like Swiss212. I'm sure a lot of these bigger geocom providers will kind of try to get into that arena as well if there's any money to be had there. But for now, there's small activities being done, like Astranis demoed Vanguard, which is a point-to-point air gap network capability. It's really cool to see. They claim it's air gapped. I have my skepticisms, but if it's true, that's a really valuable capability, and one that they've claimed they've already productized with Kymeta and I think SatCube to provide kind of warfighter networks that can be stood up on command, air gap from public networks, relayed through their satellites. If it's really air gap, that means they've implemented some sort of red-black separation on board their spacecraft that's valuable to certain tranches in the proliferated warfighter network, kind of in the vein of that DARPA Blackjack program that we talked about last week, being able to keep kind of public networks separate from private networks completely, like physically completely separated, which is cool to hear because I didn't know they were working on that. And the fact that they've already operationalized it and productized it and all that means they're much further ahead than I thought they were, and puts them in a good position, not just for a general product, but to be able to enter this, very hotbed warfighter network kind of contract arena.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the air gap sort of point-to-point network, if true, very, very impressive. If they're overselling the total independence of things, that the fundamental capability that they're demonstrating is still really valuable. But one thing that I wanted to sort of push back on, I guess, a little bit of your overall assessment of the geospatial industry is that, yes, I very much agree with you that there's a major shift coming to the geospatial industry and that it's already been here. There's been some major shifts coming for the past several decades. Fundamentally, I would argue that the shift coming to geo is not one of reduced demand, not one of like, nobody wants geospatial satellites anymore. I would say the argument is one more of price. So not that nobody wants geospatial capabilities, nobody wants geospatial products, nobody wants to pay traditional price points for those same products. So I don't think geo is dying or is dead. I think that what we will wind up seeing is a lot of innovation and a lot of different products that wind up effectively providing geospatial assets and geospatial solutions for a fraction of their traditional costs. Just, to point to Jupiter 3 again, 800 million. I think what we are likely to see is a quote unquote a new geo industry where that Jupiter 3 capability, instead of costing 800 million sticker price, costs 200 million sticker price or 300 million sticker price. I think that's more where the industry is going, that we'll see the same or similar capabilities at massive sort of cost savings, because the innovations are going to wind up reducing the total capital needed to achieve those same products and results.
I mean, one of the few players left. I mean, like, somebody that does have money, like HughesNet, Eutelsat's spending another $1 billion on their constellation. So, instead of one giant, almost $1 billion satellite, they're going to buy a bunch more OneWebs. I think they had like 500 already launched. So, I don't know. The fact that they're like spending money to grow their LEO constellation rather than spending that money on their geo assets, I'm sure that supports your point.
Well, I think that Eutelsat investing immediately in LEO capability is a pretty clear indicator of what, not indicator, but it reflects sort of the reality of today, which is the geo price point is too high. So I think that in about 3 to 5 years, Eutelsat will be investing $1 billion more in much more cost-effective geospatial assets, assuming that they haven't pivoted out of geo in its entirety. But in the immediate, for today and tomorrow, yeah, I think people are definitely going to be spending $1 billion on hundreds of LEO assets rather than $1 billion on 1 or 2 geo assets, until they're able to get to, $1 billion for a half dozen geo assets. I think you're probably right that we'll see that sort of shift and push towards the proliferated mega constellations. But there's enough innovation happening. There's enough companies developing really cool and innovative products in the geo side that this type of cost savings for the bigger birds is not unthinkable.
Yeah, I think we're just seeing a transitional period of like, a lot of these constellations, they're depending on direct to device. Like right now, Starlink needs antennas, like specialized antennas to connect to. So, but we've been talking recently about, if Qualcomm comes out with a chipset that allows a phone to connect to it, suddenly that changes the game. Starlink's ready to utilize that whenever it's available on the ground. And if Apple were to do that, again, change the game. But we're waiting on this ground architecture to not only arrive, but actually proliferate, much like we saw in the 90s with cell towers. Like we even recently we saw with 5G. The tech exists. We've always had 5 gigahertz as a frequency, but to have antennas that can operate in it, to have the infrastructure that can operate in it on the ground takes time. So I think what we're seeing is a lot of these large geo providers continuing to operate their assets in geo, with the exception of EchoStar, because screw Jupiter 3. And in the meantime, smaller companies like Astranis are kind of filling in the gaps with cheaper solutions in geo that are showing some real value, but are really just kind of trying to like wind down the market in that area to shift over to LEO constellations, where a lot of the investments being funneled towards. There's a lot of indication of the need for, and we're seeing a lot of the ground technology try to catch up to. So I think most of this is just a shift to LEO. I don't expect geo to completely go away, but I would not expect to see another Jupiter 3 ever. So I'm glad we rung that bell on the way out. But there's clearly like Astranis has some value. There's been some talk about combining geo with LEO, and that has some value. And all this activity with China and America doing RPO stuff in geo seems to indicate the nations are still concerned about activities in that regime. So I think there's still going to be a lot going on in that domain. It's not going to look like it has over the past decades.
Absolutely different, but not dead. I think if I had to shut myself up, I think that's how I would do it. Let's see here. York Space Systems filed to go public. The exploration company raised $160 million for the Nyx cargo vehicle and acquired Thrustworks Additive Manufacturing. Trans Celestial raised almost $10 million to accelerate optical communications deployment. Lean Space raised 10 million euro, a 10 million euro Series A for software-defined space missions. And Quindar raised 18 million to scale satellite operations software. I know a couple of these land a little bit more in your wheelhouse than not. I believe Lean Space and Quindar were a little bit more interesting to you. So tell me what you think about those.
Yeah, they all have something to note. York Space going public, great. I think that indicates that their 21 satellites they launched for Tranche 1 of PWSA went well. SDA said that it went well. So all indications are that their satellites are working. And, that's just the first deployment. They've got hundreds to deploy. So it's as good a time as any to go public. And I love to see space companies going public again, because it kind of died off over the past couple of years after that SPAC boom back in like 2020.
Well, that's not unique to space. That's like everybody across the spectrum sort of experienced that same boom and bust.
Yeah.
Great to see. Again, it's great to see York succeeding and then executing on a liquidation event after executing on their actual technological and operational milestones.
It's cool to see a space systems company going public. From everything I've heard, they're good at what they do. Hopefully they're very successful, and they kind of usher in another era of economic success for the space industry.
Yeah, it'll be fun to take a closer look in their books once they do go public.
The Nyx cargo vehicle is kind of interesting, just given the recent Cygnus XL launch and the JAXA HV1 launch. There seems to be a kind of surge in cargo vehicles, but this one does seem more positioned to be what we've been seeing with some of the on-orbit habitats. So companies like Axiom, like Space Lab, where they kind of create a on-orbit habitat, but it has a dual purpose of potentially being like an ISS replacement. But a lot of them are posturing to say like, we're going to use them for manufacturing hubs. And the cargo vehicle fits that really well. Like if you manufacture on orbit and need to return to Earth or need to move it to another location in space, you'll need that cargo vehicle. So, on top of raising 160 million for that cargo vehicle, they also acquired Thrustworks additive manufacturing. So it seems to be some them dipping their toes into the manufacturing space, whether that's to manufacture their cargo vehicle or whether it's to manufacture stuff on space. I think that can again serve kind of a dual purpose and positions them well in a growing industry. Transcelestial optical communications, great to see. Most of the ones that exist are being bought up, but it's a booming industry. So hopefully they're not able to just make money off of it, but actually contribute something to it, because there's still a lot of like advancement in the technology happening. So hopefully they can contribute something to the optical communications field. Lean Space, I was definitely interested in 10 million euros Series A for software-defined space missions. That's the sort of stuff that I work on currently. So I'll be interested to see kind of their approach, what they're contributing to this. It's become more of an interest recently with very flexible satellites being able to configure their missions based on software definitions. So, generally this is like getting better access to space assets for a bigger audience. It's great for demoing new missions, not having to wait to launch physical hardware and all of that. But I think the real value here is going to be when it comes to on-orbit data centers. And when we have much more compute, much more power on orbit, being able to kind of flex that capability is going to be one of the key factors in actually scaling that technology. So I think they're coming in at a good time. It's a fairly small Series A, but it's a European company, so I know they'll have plenty of money if they need it. Hopefully they come up with a great technology that's useful. And then Quindar, $18 million to scale satellite operations software. I know you said this is a very frothy space. I think that there might be some implications in on-orbit kind of traffic monitoring. There's been a lot of talk from all the nations about the need to improve that capability, because we're just waiting for some Kessler syndrome to hit, or somebody to launch a rocket into somebody else's rocket. Like, the systems are fairly out of date. The most recent update I've seen was L3Harris deploying the Atlas system with the US Space Force. That was a nice improvement, but there's still room for improvement. So I hope this technology, while it sounds like it's probably more like a B2B kind of, other space operators could use it, I think they are actually positioned well to kind of scale into that industry as well, and make major improvements for the industry as a whole.
Yeah, the satellite operations software space is fairly crowded. Lots of different folks recognize that this is a major problem that needs to be solved. And it's definitely not going to be a winner-take-all sort of scenario. So this isn't like a standards war. This isn't VHS Betamax. This isn't the sort of environment where one person is going to wind up winning this standards war and everybody's going to wind up using them. There's going to be a lot of different solutions, a lot of different sort of piecemeal. There's going to be a lot of different piecemeal solutions to this problem, and the folks who end up winning are going to be the folks who wind up collaborating and integrating with each other, so that effectively, even though a lot of these different data streams and even though a lot of the different solutions are separate, the folks who wind up winning are going to be the folks who are able to integrate and plug into and connect everything together. So it's an interesting space for sure. There's a lot of different players in there. It'll be interesting to see how Quindar manages to stick the landing and win out. 18 million is one of the larger raises that I've seen in this space. So they're well positioned to make a meaningful impact. I know we're running a little bit long here, so I'll let you take the tech advances, but
yeah,
handful of cool developments as well. Tell us about them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one we're both really excited about is the Impulse Space Mira 3 is launching on the next transporter mission. It's carrying a bunch of deployable payloads. It is a space tug after all. That's usually what they're used for, but it's also holding a few hosted missions, which, again, with space tugs, we often see this combination because there's a lot of capability, and once they're up there, they don't plan to come back down. And it's only their third mission, so they have some space to fill, and they're filling that with Zeno Aerospace, who's flying a Super Torquer, which is a torque rod. That's nothing new, but it is a generally new application for it. The idea being that they use a torque rod for attitude control rather than just reaction wheel desaturation. So typically a smaller electromagnetic rod would be used to basically hold on to Earth's magnetic field as the wheels spin down so they can be used to spin back up to control the spacecraft. Typically, you don't use a large, there's nothing physics wise because you're restricting you from using a bigger torque rod and just applying more force on the magnetic field and controlling your attitude that way. But generally it's not done because the mass is very significant. It's an iron rod with a bunch of metal wrapped around it. So very curious to see how this works. If they're able to figure out the mass problem and it's just a matter of pumping more electricity through it, this could be a really great technology, especially for scaling out things like mega constellations or orbital data centers. Like a lot of them don't need that active of control, but it's definitely great to see any sort of advancement in ACS systems because there's still a lot that can be improved there, and it's one of the most unreliable systems on a spacecraft. And having these kind of solid state systems are inherently more reliable. So that'd be great if that works. On kind of the flip side of that is another payload they're hosting is the Samara space payload. I believe you called it the Cicada. That's a much more active attitude control system, and it's less so a control system as it is a stabilization system, and they use basically noise canceling technology to kind of vibrate their solar panels to cancel out vibrations in the spacecraft to hold it very steady. This is a key technology for some missile defense tracking systems. Some payloads require very, very stable platforms, especially if they have long integration times on an imager, which can be the case with a lot of thermal imagers, hyperspectral imagers, things that are trying to pick up very sensitive stuff. And the technology behind it, the technology typically used for those applications is very expensive. And this seems to be an order of magnitude lower, especially since they're taking kind of a combined approach by integrating it into an existing system. But it'll be very interesting to see how well it works on orbit. I believe this is their first demonstration mission. So it'll be really cool to see how this works.
Yeah, we're big fans of Samara here on the show. Friends of the family, so to speak. And their tech potentially represents a step function improvement in the satellite manufacturing space as a whole. The stability and the actuation and control potential that they're bringing to the table has a lot of second order potential effects that are really meaningful and impressive. So love to see them getting an orbital demo and a chance to climb the TRL ladder, so to speak.
Also on their third mission is D-Cubed with Arrakis D3. They've launched D1 and D2. D1 was demonstrating a boom deployment, and D2 is for a smaller solar panel assembly. D3 will be for a 2-meter solar array assembly, so this is pretty large, and a great demonstration of on-orbit solar panel manufacturing. It's not quite constructing them from scratch on orbit, but that seems to be where they're trying to head. And we're seeing that with some other companies. I think StarPath was one of them. We talked about United Semiconductors with Varda and SpaceForge last week. So there are companies that are moving to manufacture solar panels on space, which would allow for much larger solar arrays. At this point, they're kind of on the scale of Redwire's ROSA, some rollout solar arrays that can get very large after being packed very tightly for launch. But this is a great technology to see, since larger solar arrays are going to be needed for things like on-orbit data centers. And I think that they're already on their third demonstration is a great signal that they've got the technology needed to kind of step up to that demand. Yank Technologies received a $1 million US a $1 million NASA Phase 3 SBIR commercialization contract to advance their dust-tolerant resonant connector for bidirectional vehicle-to-vehicle power transfer on the moon and Mars. If all those words aren't clear, they're basically building a moon power plug. It's really like they're just trying to figure out how to like connect two power devices.
Regolith is unlike anything you can possibly test with terrestrially. So it's interesting. It's interesting to see that NASA is explicitly trying to solve this and is already sort of forward-facing to Moon and Mars-based missions where power plugs need to be present. I mean, you don't need a power plug for any sort of orbital or any sort of space transfer vehicle. You need a power plug for terrestrial permanent stuff. So it's fun to see NASA putting money towards that.
Yeah, I mean, if you've ever dropped your phone in the sand on the beach, like this problem. The moon is very dusty. It's very abrasive. If you get it in your connector, it's not going to work anymore. And these things need to survive for years, constantly plugging and unplugging. So, and it's very electrostatic. So, and you're talking about power connectors, so it's like the most attractive thing for it. So what they're proposing are magnetic connectors, and that's I guess been tested since they're on Phase 3. But this is to expand the research on that and get something developed that's able to effectively like plug a rover into like a habitat so it can recharge at night. So great to see. I mean, we've talked a bit about some NASA contracts for things like spacesuits and habitats and food and all these little things needed for like lunar and Mars habitation. This is a pretty cool one to see, and I wish them luck in figuring out this problem.
Well, for all of us here at the Space Times podcast, I'm Paul Mayer with Harrison Lambert. Thank you again for joining us on this week's episode, and we'll look forward to chatting again next week.